And then it's your season, 3 seasons in one day.
This is Cleveland.
That's the beauty of our city. I mean, who else can make that claim, really? They can have tornadoes and they can have their mudslides and standing in the winds and
That's true.
earthquakes and hurricanes. We have 24 hours, 3 seasons in one day.
Good.
We're lucky.
That's true. Well, it's so cold out there. It was so warm yesterday. That's what we were talking about. How crazy it is. Just
Oh,
overnight.
I did it with my pen.
Oh, yeah. It's an hour and a half away from the zoo.
Hey, no mercy.
How are we doing?
I'm doing fine.
Sure. Good.
And boosted, right. Oh. No, you still matter to do your own. Yeah, but I really feel like you.
I know your personality. Very good at that. You don't mind if I'm sure. Right, next week since I was there, it was like Sadie, why?
Oh, yeah, it was crazy, wasn't it?
We're not in the same pod. We are now, but we weren't. Okay. Good hire. Well, yeah. You want a big one or would you like to?
Don't read it all in one
No,
sitting.
not in one breath. You want a book? Who needs a book? Oh, thank you, thank you. I have 2 of them. Can we move this? Because it's hard for me to schlepp.
So,
Yeah, the love's sitting there. Don't move it.
yes. Okay. Um, I don't know if we're recording yet or not. I'm just not sure what's going on. But good, we are recording. Thank you. But I wanted to, first of all, thank you for being here, and especially thank you for being here because as a result of the high winds of the last 2 days, we don't have internet in the building. So we're not streaming this. So a message is coming out, so my apologies to everyone who was hoping to stream this. We have a whole number of people who stream this every week. And I apologize for us not being able to stream today, but we are recording this session, and the recording will be made available to everyone. And it's not something that we control. This is just one of those things that happened, and sadly we're just unable to stream today. This is not about our equipment. This is about the internet being down because of things that occurred outside. And it's just the way it is, and there's just nothing we can do about it. So it's a challenge, it's a problem. I'm already here. I'm getting messages. Oh, wait a minute. The streaming is working. The streaming is working. So I'm just getting a message saying that the streaming is working. Which is brand new. So I guess it's kind of a Hanukkah miracle, or a post-Hanukkah miracle, or a streaming miracle, which is great. I didn't realize the streaming was working. Yesterday we had a we had a life cycle event and we needed to make adjustments. I mean, all of these things are happening in real time. You know that we've had some high winds and some rain, and these are the kinds of things that have happened. So I'm glad to hear that the streaming is working, and thank you for letting me know. And so we're going to move forward. And it's great to see all of you here today. And it's great to know that there are people back home who are able to watch. And in any event, a recording is going to be made available to this. It's all good. So now let's move forward and let's really get to the crux of the scroll of Ruth today. Let's get to the crux of the scroll of Ruth. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to the conversion issue today, but let's really get to the crux of it, because I would like to really complete our introduction to the scroll of Ruth in this and the next session, which is next Sunday, because we're going to be off for Christmas, the Christmas weekend and the New Year weekend. So over these 2 weekends, we're going to be off again. So I'm reminding everyone we're going to be off. So if you have Hebrew Bibles, we're going to use them today, and we're going to really start to get to the crux of what it is that we're reading, and to really try to put everything together in the next 2 sessions with regard to the scroll of Ruth. There's so much more to say, and I have to limit myself. I have to figure out how to say it briefly, and I'm going to try to get straight to the point right now today. I'm going to try to really get straight to the issue and to talk about the very core of the scroll of Ruth, and do that in this session and the next session. We spoke for the time being about a number of elements regarding the scroll of Ruth, and we've really set ourselves up, and I think set ourselves up really well. We talked about the language of the scroll of Ruth, and we talked about the language of the scroll of Ruth and the tension that's created by the language from the very first words. Vayhi bimei, right? Remember, the very first words, the tension that's being created. On the one hand, this, what really is a family and in certain ways almost pastoral story. And on the other hand, language that relates to international affairs and politics and states and kings and vassals and formulae that don't seem to fit. And we talked about the tension, setting ourselves up for what becomes this remarkable story, and really the finest story in many ways in the Hebrew Bible. So we talked about that. And we also talked about the entire story being anchored in the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. Everything in this story revolves around the relationship, the covenantal relationship between Ruth and Naomi. And while we start out the story with men's names, the men recede within 2.5 verses from the story. They go away. We know, I mean, they're basically no longer there. And they only emerge towards the end of it again in the last one chapter, one and a bit chapters. They return to our story. So really, only in chapters 3 and 4 do the men re-emerge, and they re-emerge in a way that is not dominant. So all of these things are taking place. All of these things are occurring at the same time. But we are going to talk about the covenantal relationship between Ruth and Naomi, and we're going to describe it. And you're going to see that today the subject of our session is family. We're going to talk about family. We're going to talk about what family means. And, after Thanksgiving and now towards the winter break, we have family on our minds. Everybody has family on their minds. And we have family on our minds. And we're going to talk about family. We're going to talk about family. We're going to talk about biological family. We're going to talk about constructed family. We're going to talk about family, the subject of the scroll of Ruth, the subject of this book. Through love, through wisdom, through covenant, through faith is family. We're getting to family. now. We're going to really talk about family. Okay? And we talk about this in the context of pain, of death, of the loss of life, the loss of husband, the loss of children, and the loss of a prospect for life. We talk about the language of mara, the language of bitterness, right? And we talk about partnership and covenant and hope and redemption and the notion that we don't always know where redemption comes from. And sometimes redemption comes from different places that we hadn't anticipated, right? Okay, so, yeah.
What is the Jewish definition of redemption? What does it mean?
What is the definition of redemption is the question. How do we define redemption? I'm going to take the liberty of not answering the question, and not answering the question because it is so extraordinarily complicated, because it is layered, because the word redemption means different things at different times for different people. The root of the word redemption in Hebrew is Gimel, Aleph, Lamed, G-A-L, right? Gimel, Aleph, Lamed, or G-A-L if you like, right? That is the root of the Hebrew word for redemption. And for our purposes, but only for our very limited and narrow purposes right now, redemption is going to mean allowing for the prospect of the advancement of life. Allowing for life to proceed, right? It means creating a setup, creating a situation that allows for life to continue for particular people, for a family, for a nation, right? Allowing for life to proceed, prolonging and advancing life. That, for the time being, is going to be our notion of redemption, and the facilitation of that requires more than that. It requires the ability to have sustenance. It requires sometimes legal arrangements, sometimes political arrangements, sometimes a whole number of other things, but that's what, for the time being, that is going to be the core of what we look at in terms of redemption, though it's not the whole story, and I'm not going to go into the rest of it right now. Okay? Okay. So that's what we're going to say. We're going to look for new life, right? And the question is, in the face of death, in the face of pain, in the face of loss, and in the face of the breakdown of family, because what happens when a spouse dies? What happens when children die? What happens when a parent passes away? The family changes. The family is altered in a way that is irreversible, that is impossible to remedy, right? And that breakdown is not something that you can just repair or replace. There is something here that happens that we now have to somehow learn to live with. And that we have to learn to live with in a new reality, in a way that will mean that our lives will move forward differently. It's going to be different. Right? Am I? Yes? And that is what we're looking at. That is what we're looking at. Yes? So that's going to be the subject of what we speak about today, and we're going to speak about the way it functions in the scroll of Ruth, in the story of Ruth. So get ready. We're about to get into something that I don't know to what degree you're familiar with. Bear with me if there are any questions. There's a microphone here. Ask your questions. Don't hesitate. People at home can text me and email me, and I will try to respond either as I go or after the session, and we will try to figure this out as we go. Okay, here we go. Deuteronomy chapter 25. Open to Deuteronomy chapter 25. If anyone knows the page number, let me know the page number. Deuteronomy chapter 25 is one of a series of a couple of Torah portions that have the single densest, the single most dense, most intense collections of different laws in the whole of our Pentateuch. Deuteronomy 25 is one of those. Do you have a page number? 312. Page 312. We turn to page 312. We're only looking at a few verses, and here is the biblical, the Deuteronomic, remember, 7th century, 8th, 7th century, before the Common Era, starting in the 8th, leading to the early 7th century, before the Common Era redaction. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. Let's take a look at this. And what does that say? What does that say? When brothers dwell together, really important, when brothers dwell together. This is for families that are united. This is for siblings who are together. This is not families that are, where the siblings don't speak to each other. We're not talking about a Jacob and Esau situation, about an Isaac and Ishmael situation. This is when brothers dwell together, when siblings dwell together. One of them dies and leaves no son. The elder one, imagine, dies and leaves no son. The wife of the deceased shall not be married to a stranger, to someone on the outside. We're not just going to say, go, find your way. Good luck. It was nice to know you. Right? Her lever, right? We're talking about levirate marriage, right? Her lever, in other words, the person who is there to take care of her because she was the spouse of the sibling. She's a member of the family to whom the lever bears responsibility. The lever will come upon her, take her as his wife, and incorporate her into the household. That's what the Bible says. That's what the Bible requires of us. The book of Deuteronomy, right? Yes? The assumption here is that this is her interest. This is what she wants. Yes? Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question. What if that brother is married already? In the biblical world, the brother is asked to take on an additional wife, right? And support an additional wife and create with that wife another branch of a family, right? Yes, and to do so on behalf of, on account of the deceased brother, as, if you like, an act of love for that brother who is gone. Yes? We do not, there is no such thing as so how is it modified for modern times is the question. We do not practice this in modern times. We do not, the entire structure of family has altered for us in modern times. Rabbeinu Gershom, as we know, we spoke about this, who lived between the years of 960 and 1040, 1038, to the Common Era, and is one of the founders of the rabbinic tradition of Western Europe, which we are all products of, enacted 3 enactments, and one of these enactments prohibited anything but monogamy. Prohibited marriage to more than one wife. What the enactment was that a person may marry a wife beyond his wife, beyond one's wife, if the first wife approves in writing of that marriage, which ended bigamy, which ended the practice completely. In reality, Ashkenazi Jewry had already switched to monogamy by that time, right? But in any event, it's been more than 1,000 years. There is, our family structure doesn't allow for it. Yes?
Does it work the same for sisters? When one of them dies, is her sister obligated in any way to take care of her dead sister's family?
Candy, what a wonderful question. Is it egalitarian? Is this egalitarian? Is there an equivalent requirement or an equivalent obligation or an equivalent call to sisters, to women, to take care of each other's families, right? When a spouse passes away, when a catastrophe hits, not here. Not here. In reality, yes. That's the story of Ruth. Right? That's precisely the story of Ruth.
Yes.
Right? Between Naomi and Ruth, that's exactly what we're seeing. But is there a formal requirement in our Hebrew Bible? No.
So that's
Right.
not ever understood more broadly as when siblings dwell or
We're going to talk about this.
women.
So the question is it understood more broadly? Is there a broader understanding of women taking care of each other under these circumstances? Hang on to this question. We're going to answer that question, and the answer is in the scroll of Ruth. We're going to respond to that question. Here, formally, in the legal writings, in the book of Deuteronomy, right now, the answer is no. But we're going to respond to that question. We're going to get there. Yes? Okay? Okay? So the lever is asked to come in and to marry that woman who's now the widow of the brother, right? If they dwelt together and if there were no children of that marriage. So if they dwell together and there are no children, the brother is called upon to be a lever and to assume responsibility for the wife, of course assuming that she has an interest in that. Yes, China.
So you do mean no children. You mean the daughter would not extend this.
In the biblical period, it meant no son, right? The rabbis at a certain point said no children, much, much, much later on. But here, in the 8th century before the Common Era, no son. In other words, the name would not move forward. The name would not survive. Yes? Right? Remember the conditions of the times we're living in, right? Yeah. Okay. Deborah, did you? Well, so Deborah, right. So Deborah is saying it's a matter of privilege and the way society was structured at the time, and land ownership and a whole number of other elements that reflect independence or lack of independence. In other words, there are many things that go into this. You are 100% right, but there are signs that things were not quite as clear as this structure would suggest. And again, we're going to get back to the story of Ruth and we're going to talk about this. Yes?
Was there an understanding that if there were no brother, that another family member, a relative,
Great question. My goodness, you're asking every right question here. In other words, if there is no brother, the question is asked here. Margie asked the question. If there is no brother, does this obligation extend to other family members? To the next of kin? If there is no brother, would it, an uncle or a cousin or a nephew or anyone else, would this extend to anyone else? Here in Deuteronomy chapter 25, no. It extends to brothers. Not only brothers, brothers who live together, right? In the case of there being no child, let's just say no son for the time being. Okay? Good. Good. Wonderful question, right? The first son that she bears after this union shall be raised to the dead brother, right? The Hebrew word is yakim, yakum, right? The notion of Kufva Med, to established. That child will be established, which we understand means the name of the child. The child will be named, will carry the legacy of the deceased brother, right? So that the deceased brother's name would not be blotted out, so that a person would not be forgotten, right? Which now brings us to a new subject, which is the subject of memory and how we remember the deceased, which is a subject we're going to come to, but not right now. I'm raising this as an issue because this is raised here, and it's so extraordinarily important, right? Think about this, about legacy and how we maintain legacy, how we remember, right? And we're going to talk about that, but not right now, okay? Now comes the crux of it. If this man, the brother, does not want to marry his brother's, the deceased brother's wife or the brother's widow, right? The widow shall appear before the elders at the gate. She will go to court. She will go to the elders at the gate. In other words, the place that functions like a court in these ancient Israelite towns, and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his deceased brother. I want to be married to that brother. He does not want to marry me. Maybe he has another family. Maybe there's other things going on. He doesn't want to do it. He cannot do it. He doesn't want to do it, right? And he's not willing to perform his duty. He's not willing to function as a lever. It's a biblical commandment. He's not willing to do it, right? The elders of the town shall then summon and talk to him. In other words, now a legal process and an investigation are launched, right? This is what a legal process looks like, right? They bring him in, they investigate him, they investigate the situation, they call witnesses, a process is launched, right? Yes? Right? Does this make, yeah? Good, okay. So this is right. If he does insist, she's right, and he says, yes, you are right, I am supposed to marry you. By biblical law, I have an obligation to marry you, but I am not willing to marry you. I'm not willing to do it. This is not something, this doesn't fit with my life. I cannot do it. I'm not willing to do it. She will then go up to him. If that is the conclusion of this legal process, she will then go up to him, pull the sandal off his foot, remove the feet, remove the shoe off his foot, right? Which is humiliating, right? I mean, it's, right? Remove the shoe off it and spit in his face. Right? In other words, this is not pleasant, right? Awful. And make this declaration, thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, and then he is humiliated, right? And at the same time, the court cannot force him to marry against his will, right? But it's very clear that this is frowned upon, that him not marrying her is frowned upon, and then his house is labeled as the house of a person who wouldn't perform that obligation, that duty, to maintain the brother's memory through levirate marriage. Yes?
Is she then allowed to marry anyone she wishes?
And she's liberated. Now she can marry other people, but now she has to go out. And remember, now she's a widow, and she's childless. This is not an easy situation to be in, right? Okay? It's not simple in that society, in that setting, right? It's not straightforward, right? She's on her own now, right? She doesn't have the backing of that family, a home, a living, people taking care of her, a support network. She doesn't now, she's on her own. It's different. Yes? Think about the story of Ruth. Now we're going to go quickly into the story that is the parallel story to the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, is written with another biblical story in mind. We're going to read it now. Ready? Here we go. Genesis chapter 38. Turn to Genesis chapter 38. What page are we on? Does anyone know? 60? 60. Page 60. Thank you very much. The story of Judah and Tamar, we're going to go through it really quickly just because we are so short on time. But that is the parallel passage to the scroll of Ruth. The scroll of Ruth is a response and in dialogue with the story of Judah and Tamar. We're going to see why. Okay? And remember, we have to think about Deuteronomy 25 as we read this story. Okay? Here we go. We're going to read the salient parts of it, almost the entire chapter. Judah left his brothers. Remember, brother dwells with other brothers, the brothers that dwell together. Judah left his brothers. It's there for a reason. Camped near an Adulamite whose name was Heir, right? Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite. Bad news. Not so good, right? Whose name was Shua, and he married her, cohabited with her, and she bore a son, and he named him Heir, and she conceived again, bore another son, named him Onan, and again bore a son, named him Shelach. Right? Heir, Onan, and Shelach are the names of the three, right? Okay. Remember what happened with the husband of Naomi? Remember Avimelech? Remember Elimelech, the husband of Naomi? Remember that they left, right? They left town with their 2 children, right? And Judah takes a wife for Heir, and her name is Tamar, in the way that they allow their children to marry the local women, the Moabites, Orpah and Ruth, right? He no longer lives with his brothers. He's married this Canaanite woman. He's established his own family. There are children, these 3 boys, Heir, Onan, and Shelach. And Heir has a wife, and she's called Tamar. Right? So far, so good? Yes? Okay. Good. Heir, Judah's firstborn, Ra b'nei Adonai, is evil or bad in the sight of God, in God's eye. It actually says in the eye, not eyes. In the eyes of God, in the sight of God, and God takes his life. Where does this leave Tamar? Tamar is now a widow. There is no child. Right? Remember Ruth? Yes? Ruth is a widow with no child. Tamar is a widow with no child. Look at all the parallels here. Yes? Okay. Judah said to Onan, "Join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her." This is an obligation. This is a duty. This is a commandment. As a brother-in-law, provide offspring for your brother. Right? You're establishing your brother's estate. Right? You're doing this on behalf of your brother. No one is closer to your brother than you. You are the second in line. Heir has died. Onan, you take over. And you do this on account of and in honor of your brother. Yes? Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his because he's doing it on behalf of his brother. It's his brother's estate. The child is going to be called by the name of the brother. The inheritance is going to be the inheritance of the estate of the brother, right? It's not for him. It's not his own family. It's his brother's family. He, knowing that the seed would not count as his, spills it to waste whenever he joins with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother, right? He says, right? In other words, he's pretending, he's acting as if, but he's doing everything he can so that she doesn't have an offspring. Right? He spills his seed to the ground, and the rest I leave to your imagination. Right? This is what happens here. Now, This is the story. God does not like this. And God takes his life. Now, here is Judah, who's lost 2 sons. How many sons did Naomi lose? Judah lost 2 sons. And Tamar is widowed a second time. Right? Now imagine this situation. Just think about this for a moment. Think what Judah must be going through. Think what this family must be going through. Heir seemed to be just fine, marries Tamar and dies. Onan seems to be just fine, marries Tamar and dies. Where's the variable here and where's the constant, right? Like what might be going on here, right? Is this woman killing off my children, right? What's happening here? Right? Think about this for a moment. And think about a family being destroyed by this successive loss of children with no offspring, with no kids. Right? Okay? And there's a lot more into this, the parental relationship between Judah and his sons, which we're not going to go into right now, but which one day we can talk about. Okay? So Onan dies. God takes his life. And Judah says to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house. Please go away. Please go to your father's house. Please leave us alone. Right? Until my son Shelach grows up. Right? And he's thinking he too might die like his brothers. Look, I'm going to lose my third. What could happen here? I might lose my third. Are you familiar with the story? Do you know the story? Right? No? Okay. Right? Remarkable, remarkable text. So Tamar went to live with her father at her father's house. And then Judah's wife, the Canaanite woman, dies. And Judah goes up to Timnah to tend to his flock with his friend Heir the Adulamite. Now Timnah, we're not going to talk about today. Samson goes to Timnah. And it is at around Timnah that Samson falls in love with a Philistine woman. This is the book of Judges. We're not going to talk about all of that. Timnah is very significant. Remember that Timnah is significant and that we don't have the time to talk about it. Timnah also happens to be a border town, a border city that is given to Joshua, that is at the very boundary of the tribe of Judah. Timnah is halfway between Jerusalem and Ashdod, almost exactly halfway, not far from the town of Beit Shemesh. About 20 minutes, 15 minutes drive from the town of Beit Shemesh. And what happens is that the mountains of Jerusalem grow lower and descend into the plain that leads to the coast on the Mediterranean. The coast on the Mediterranean is dominated by the Philistines in the story of Samson, right? The mountains are dominated by the Judeans, by the Israelites. And there is a struggle over that territory in between, the plain and the hills, the foothills of Judah in between, wherein there is a major roadway between Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey on the one hand in the north, and Egypt in the south. The trade of the ancient Near East between Syria, Turkey in the north, and Egypt in the south goes through that plain. So you want to control that plain. And the Philistines and the Israelites are fighting for that control. They're vying for that control. The Philistines have control over the sea, the ports, the maritime trade, the Israelites are on the mountain and control the strategic high ground of the mountain, right? And there is a struggle at the time for that plain around the area of Timnah, and we know that there's been life in Timnah. We have found archaeological evidence, Tel el-Batash it's called in Hebrew. We found archaeological evidence dating back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. There was already habitation there, right? So Timnah in itself is very significant. We're not going to talk about Timnah today. It's just a parenthetical comment. He goes up to Timnah, and Tamar is told, your father-in-law is coming to Timnah for sheep sharing. Now, in the meantime, she lives with her father as a widow and cannot be married because she hasn't been released by the family of Judah. And at the same time, she's waiting for Shelach to grow up. So she cannot remake her life. She's a widow, and she has no offspring, and time is ticking. Now she's been married to 2 people already, to Heir and to Onan, right? So time is ticking. Yes? Okay. Okay. This is the situation. This is what's happening. Here comes the story. So she took off her widow's garb, her widow's clothing, covered her face with a veil, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelach was grown up, he was of a marriable age, and that she was not offered to marry Shelach. When Judah saw her, he took her for a prostitute. His wife had died. She had her face covered, so he turned aside to her by the road and said, let me come to you. Charming story, right? You like it? People ask me, what do I read this stuff for? It's interesting. Some interesting things here. Let me come to you. And he did not, of course, know that she was his daughter-in-law. Right? And here comes a negotiation. Now, remember the story of Ruth. Always bear in mind the story of Ruth as we read this. The 2 stories are written in dialogue with each other. What she asked, will you pay me? Right? Oh, I'll send you a goat from my flock. Yeah, that's right. What will you give me as security now? Not what you'll pay me later. I'll never see you again, right? What will you, I need some security now. I need a pledge right now. And she says what's going to be your seal and cord and the staff that you carry. You leave here your driver's license. You leave here your photo ID. And when you pay me, I'll give it back to you. Right? Okay. Okay. So he gave them to her, and she conceived by him. Do you like the story? Yeah, this is our foreparent, Judah, right? She conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off this clothing, and she put back her widow's garb. She went back to her father's house. Right? She left. Judah takes a kid, gets the friend to get a kid to go and pay the prostitute with a kid from the flock. She's no longer there. She went home. They couldn't find her. He inquires of people. Wasn't there a woman here? No. Nobody's seen anybody. Nobody knows. There isn't, what do you think we are? What, a red light district? There's no one here. What are you talking about? What are you... No, there's been no one here, right? Couldn't, the friend goes back to Judah saying, couldn't find her. We don't know where she is. And of course, Judah, there's no prostitute here. And you can read the chapter. There's some humor in the chapter. Judah says, it's your fault. I sent the kid, you can't find her. What's going to happen? They're going to make a laughingstock of me, right? I mean, there's even a lighthearted moment in the story, though the story is not a funny story. But there's a moment there of the Bible turning this around, right? And this is from the school of Rembrandt. This is a painting of Judah and Tamar, and I want you to see what this looks like, right? This is the finest one. There are a number of others. Judah and Tamar was widely painted in the 17th and 18th centuries. I selected this painting. There are a number of others that I could select. In many of these paintings, Judah and Tamar, and I want you to see this, are seen as equals. There's a negotiation taking place. There's an exchange taking place. Tamar has agency. She is acting. She's negotiating on her behalf. She knows what she's about. She knows what she's doing. Judah is in the dark. Judah is the one who is, if you like, deceived, right? Right? And you see that here. You see that negotiation taking place. This isn't a relationship of fear of the man by the woman. This is not, you see what is happening here, right? Yes? And of course in 17th century Dutch clothing, which is of course what they must have worn. Yeah, but it's really remarkable. The setting of this is remarkable. Again, a pastoral setting of two equals, of a man and woman. And remember, this is very Renaissance. This is really, it's quite remarkable. I just want you to see this. Yes? From the school of this actually is a painting that is displayed in Boston. But we're going to talk about this. Yeah, go ahead, Deborah. So Deborah is saying correctly, right, that the agency here is a product of a lack of power or a lack of freedom to act as her own free agent because she is bound as a widow in a situation that doesn't allow her freedom, doesn't allow her to go out there, does not allow her to marry whom she likes or to move on with her life. In other words, the product is the product of a lack of agency. Esther, lack of agency. Ruth, lack of agency, right? But in the midst of all of this, they're not sitting back. We're not just sitting back and waiting and playing the game, right? There's something going on here that shows taking one's life into one's own hands, even by doing something that's very risque, and challenging and morally questionable, right? But that she feels she has to do, right? Right? Yes? Okay. Okay. So we have that. 3 months later, Judah is told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been a harlot. Oy vey. Your daughter-in-law Tamar has gone astray. Look, she is pregnant. She's a widow. She was supposed to be at her father's house. She's pregnant. This is not a miracle. This means something has happened that shouldn't have happened. Right? And what is Judah's response? Take her out and burn her. Right? Yes? How dare she? Right? So she's being brought out. Now there's another legal process, right? She's being accused of infidelity. She's being accused of being a harlot. She's being accused of engaging in unlawful sexual relations, right? She's taken out, and she sends a message to Judah in public. Remember, she's about to be put to death. There's a process taking place. And she sends a message. Judah is, of course, with people, saying, yeah, the child belongs to this person. Right? And she says, look at these. And suddenly Judah remembers what he tried to forget. And he ends up saying, she is more righteous than I am. Tamar ends up in his household as his wife, and he never cohabits with her again. But he supports her. He supports her as part of his household. Okay? It's a remarkable, remarkable story. Okay? Okay. Then, when the time comes for her to give birth, there are twins. The midwife is there. A hand emerges. And the midwife sees that hand and manages to wrap around the hand a crimson kind of bracelet, you know, of tweed, a kind of bracelet, right, around the arm. By the way, that in itself is very significant. Remember the story of Rachav, remember other stories wherein, again, I just want to say it's significant. We're not going to talk Rachav, Jericho, the conquest of Jericho, putting a crimson line from her window as a sign to Joshua and his troops. The whole thing is significant. We're not going to talk about it now. I'm just mentioning that this is too also significant, right? And then after the hand is out, the hand comes back in and the other baby comes out. The baby without that crimson comes out. And that child who comes out first is called Peretz, and the other son is called Zerach. Right? So here the child who seemed to be coming second comes out first, and therefore we call him Peretz, and the other son we call Zerach. That is the story. Right? Tamar has children. Tamar, in a sense, and this is a partial response to your question, has been somehow redeemed with life. There is life for Tamar. There's life, there's security, there's status, and she has been exonerated and accepted. Right? Within the context of family. And this is now the family being together. Tamar is a part of Judah's household. In other words, it's not a brother. It's now a parent, which is problematic. But it's now a parent. Remember that. We're going to talk about this again in one moment. Right? It's a generation above. It's not what it says in the book of Deuteronomy. This is not the kind of levirate marriage we read about in Deuteronomy 25. And nevertheless, this is what's happening here. This is the story. Yes, Marie. So why did Judah take her in? Why did Judah take her in? He takes her in, number one, because he is shamed about his treatment of the widow of his two boys who had passed away, the double widow of the two boys who had passed away, right? And with him having set her away and not taking care of her, as part of his household, right? Which goes against the norms that we read about here, number one. Number two, he's the parent of the child. She can prove that he's the parent of this child, and then it turns out, when she gives birth, it's not one child, it's twins. But as far as he knows at the time of the trial, it's a child. She's pregnant with child, right? So number one, she's part of the family, and he's been setting her aside. Now it's obvious that the issue is not that she couldn't conceive, right? She's been able to conceive, and he's the parent of the child. There are a number of reasons for him, Judah, in response to your question, why does Judah take her in? A number of reasons for him to take it. Now, obviously, this is all public. Everybody knows. What's he going to do? Not take her in, right? I'm sorry? He was going to burn her. That's exactly right. Not knowing that they were his children, that this was his child. At the time, he believed there was one child until she was coming to give birth. He knew she was pregnant, but he was going to burn her because he believed that she had been playing around, fooling around with other people. That's exactly right. He was ready to take her out and burn her. Great, let's get rid of her. I lost my 2 sons. I'm worried for my 3rd. Here is my way out, right? And at the cost of this person's life, right? Yes. Horrifying. Horrifying. Yes, Margie.
Are there echoes here of Lot and his daughters? That's for very different reasons, obviously.
Very different. There are all kinds of echoes. Noah and Lot, there are all kinds of echoes. You're absolutely right, Margie. Are there echoes of Lot and his daughters? There are echoes of these stories wherein parents and children or in-laws cohabit and regenerate, right? There are echoes. We're not going to go into this because I want to move us forward. Yeah.
One other question. Is the tradition of Levirate marriage in any other surrounding cultures, or was that unique to Judaism?
So great question. The next question is, are there any echoes of Levirate marriage in other cultures? Or is this unique to Hebrew or Israelite culture? Yes, there are echoes in other ancient Near Eastern cultures of a family system of support that includes a kind of Levirate marriage in other cultures and a kind of tribalism that occurs within families as a way of maintaining family estates together and regenerating a next generation for families and strengthening families generation to generation. So it's not unique to Hebrew or Israelite culture. Great question. Yes? Okay? Okay. We move forward. Why did we just read this? All of these parallels. We read this because all of these parallels between the story of Genesis 38 and the story of Ruth. You see the parallels, right? You see the parallels. There's another reason. As if this wasn't good enough. As if there weren't enough good reasons for us to read the story in conjunction with Ruth. As if we were going to miss it. There is another reason. Here it is. These are the generations of Peretz, the same Peretz who was born to Tamar and Judah. In the book of Ruth, the very end of the book of Ruth, chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, these are the generations of Peretz. Peretz begot Hetzron, Hetzron Ram, Ram Aminadav, Aminadav Nachshon, Nachshon Salmon, Salmon Boaz, Boaz Oved, Oved Jesse, Yishai, and Yishai Jesse, King David of Israel. Were it not for Tamar, and for Tamar acting like a prostitute at the side of the road, we would not have King David. Were it not for this widow finding her way back into that family of Judah, none of this would be taking place. The story of Genesis 38 and the story of the book of Ruth are joined at the hip by Peretz. Peretz is the explanation for the story of Ruth. Without Peretz, it wouldn't have happened. The elder son of Judah and Tamar. This is why we read the story. In defense of levirate marriage, in defense of ensuring that these women who are widows are not abandoned and thrown out and thrown off and discarded by their families. I told you, this is about family. It's about family dynamic. It's about what happens in the context of loss with families. It's about sometimes, I don't want to say assigning guilt or blame, but it is about associating the death. If not assigning guilt or blame, then associating the death of a loved one with a spouse or with someone else or with someone whom we feel, somehow bears some responsibility for this and the implications for this. It's about the alienation of relatives that occurs sometimes with death. Right? Give me 1 second. Yes, Marie.
This is just real quick. I think it's about a woman taking matters into her own hands.
Oh, there's no question that Tamar, as we said, thank you, Marie says this is about a woman taking matters into her own hands. Absolutely, we said that was what we said. But to what end? To the final result of her being incorporated into the fold of Judah's household and having children and renewed life. Right? This is the final consequence or result of the story of Tamar, which Tamar on her own leads to. Tamar takes her own life and her own actions in that direction and allows that to happen. Assuming tremendous risk, right? But nevertheless, doing it wisely and making this happen for herself. Yes?
Is there any connection, this is a leap, between the story of Tamar and Ruth to the Holocaust and the survival of...
It's a very interesting question. So Carol is asking whether there's any relationship between the story and stories that emerge after the Holocaust and the survival of so many people who are widowed, so many people who are separated, so many people who lost family. The notion of levirate marriage is revived by rabbis, by traditional rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, after the Holocaust, with the notion of trying to reconstruct, trying to rebuild. Of course, this is not in the same... There's no question that the same structures of family and the same laws can apply, but these notions are revived after the Second World War and the Holocaust. That's a wonderful question. Right? Yes. Okay? One last one, yes?
So, do we think that the story of Ruth was all written by one person? Because it seems like there's this piece about Ruth, just like there's the piece in the Song of Songs that seems to be more about a woman. And then at the end, we get back to this whole thing of the male generations.
So nothing in the Hebrew Bible, not a single text in the Hebrew Bible, but for perhaps some of the Psalms. Not a single text in the Hebrew Bible was composed by one person. When we read biblical text, we assume that they were written and redacted by multiple people. The mere passage of time between the writing of these texts and their redaction and their becoming canonized in the 3rd to the turn of the 2nd century before the Common Era, that in itself suggests multiple hands, right? Now, it may be that there are certain texts, like particular Psalms, that weren't touched, and that are very coherent and cohesive and are pieces of poetry in and of themselves. But all of these texts are redacted and written by multiple people. All of them. All of them.
It just seems like it comes back to this, oh, here are these women. Oh, but really it's about the men.
So now there's another element to this. And the question of whether this is about women or about the men. And that's it's a wonderful insight. Why are we returning to men? Why can't we allow for this piece of text to fully be about the women? Hold on to that question, because it really is about the women. And even the text makes that clear, right? We're going to get to that. We're going to talk about that. But the men can't do it without the women. And in certain ways, the women cannot do this without the men. And for us, for the biblical author to suggest that the Davidic line has emerged from what effectively was an act of prostitution, of paid sexual intercourse between Judah and Tamar, that was the impetus of Tamar, that represented the agency of Tamar, wherein Tamar was the person who was deciding what to do, and it was Judah who was in the dark, is an act of tremendous courage. That inclusion in the biblical story is an inclusion of tremendous courage, right? That speaks to the values that we're talking about here. Let me tell you, many, many rabbis would much rather this weren't included. Right? And we're gonna talk about this a little bit more. Now, may I take a few more minutes of your time? May I complete this and take a few more minutes of your time? I know we're running out of time, but may I? Look at what happens in chapter 3 of the Scroll of Ruth. Go back to chapter 3 of the Scroll of Ruth, right? Ruth encounters Boaz, goes to that sheltered, whatever it might be, if it's it doesn't matter, the grange, she goes to that place wherein they collect the grain, that storage area wherein Boaz is sleeping, and according to the biblical text, she just goes there and sleeps at his feet. Okay. And he wakes up in the middle of the night. He's startled. He realizes there's someone there. He says, "Who is this? Who is here?" And she says, "I am your handmaid, Ruth." And then she says to him, she comes out and she says, "Spread your robe over your handmaid. You are my redeeming kinsman." Gimel Aleph Lamed. You are my redeemer. Goel, redeeming kinsman. And he says to her, "Be blessed of God, daughter." He calls her daughter. Who was the last person to call her daughter? Who was the last person to call Ruth daughter? Naomi. That's exactly right. Remember? Yes? He calls her daughter. Remember this. Do you remember we said Judah and Tamar, the two generations? The generation of the parent and the generation of the daughter, right? Daughter, your latest deed of loyalty is greater than the first. You have not turned to the younger men. In other words, I, Boaz, recognize that I'm the age of your father. I am of that generation. What are you looking for with an older guy like me? Look at me, right? But look, you have come to me instead of looking for younger men, right? So your loyalty to Naomi is praiseworthy, but even more praiseworthy is you are looking for your redeemer. You're not looking for some younger guy out there. Rich, poor, right? Looking into what they drive, where they live, right? Okay? He recognizes Boaz, again, is not just a redeemer, he's a father figure. Again, Tamar and Yehudah, Judah and Tamar, again another parallel. Remember we spoke about this briefly. Yes? Now, daughter, he treats her as a daughter, right? This is not a love story, if you like, of two spouses, of a man and a woman coming together. There is a father-daughter relationship forming here, right? Now, daughter, have no fear. I will do on your behalf whatever you ask. In other words, I'm going to act on your behalf. I'm going to protect you. There is something paternalistic going on here. You see that through the text, through the language, right? And I will take care of this with the elders of the town. I will go on through the process. I will do the administrative judicial process that's required. What's the issue? I am your redeeming kinsman, but there's another redeemer who's closer than I am. You have a relative who's closer than I am. Right? Now, stay here over the night. Leave before people see you. In the morning, I will make sure that he knows he's going to be offered the opportunity to be your redeemer because he's the next in line, right? This is the way this works, right? I'm a little bit further out. I'm only the second in line. He's the first. But if he does not want to act as a redeemer for you, I will take you under my wing as God lives, right? Yes, you see what's happening here. Boaz goes to the gate, sits down, the Redeemer comes in, he calls him out, he has him sit down, he takes 10 elders, remember Minyan? 10 elders, right? Excellent. Takes 10 elders and says, seated here, he sits them down, which again is an indication of his age. He's able to do that. He's able to bring about the elders. He himself is among the elders. He sits them down and he says, Naomi, now returned from the country of Moab, must sell a piece of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. What is this about to begin with? A piece of land. Someone has to redeem that piece of land, and through that piece of land to secure Naomi, right? And he says to the kinsman, to the redeemer, now purchase it, right? And create that infrastructure for Naomi to be able to live, to be able to be sustained as her redeemer, right? And this is the beginning of it, right? Okay. The person says, yes, I'll buy the piece of land. I can buy that piece of land. I can do it, right? He says, I will redeem it. And then Boaz continues and says, wait, good, great. I'm so glad you can buy this piece of land. When you acquire the property from Naomi and Ruth the Moabite, you must also acquire the wife of the deceased, right? The wife of the son of Elimelech is Ruth, who is here. She's here. She's the widow of the deceased. You have to take her in as your wife to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. Remember Genesis 38 and Deuteronomy 25? Right? Does this make sense? No longer just brothers. No longer just brothers. Next of kin. You remember we asked the question, does this extend beyond brothers? Right? Here it extends beyond brothers. And the Redeemer replies, in that case, I can't do it. I can't do it. Remember Deuteronomy 25. Remember the whole thing with the shoe and the spitting, and, right? I can't do it. I have my own, I can't do it. I can't do it. There's no way I can take that kind of thing on. Right? Okay. So this was formally done in Israel in case to validate this is how we know, by the way, that this was written, that this text was written before Deuteronomy 25. Right? Deuteronomy 25 codifies and changes and alters a practice that's been a much older practice in a whole number of cultures. This was formally done in it to validate transactions. People would take off their sandal, hand it to the other. In other words, exchange of shoes is a way of symbolizing partnership, symbolizing trust, right, in each other. The Redeemer says to Boaz, acquire for yourself, draws off the sandal, and Boaz says to the elders and to the rest of the people, you are witnesses today that I'm acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion, her son, right, who had been married to Ruth. Yes? and that I'm acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, the wife of Machlon, not Chilion, as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. I am doing this on behalf of, as an act of love for family. I'm doing this as a father figure. I'm doing this on behalf of the family and perpetuating the name of the family. Perpetuating memory and legacy, right? Peretz, Yehuda and Tamar, the perpetuation of the family legacy, family support, family alienation, redemption, how all of that has come about, and levirate marriage. I've gone over time today. We will continue this next time. Thank you for bearing with me.